and my name is Ira. And yesterday's Rudy books, I read that 2 books at school. So today we'll read new book and new stories, okay? And today we'll read Marvin Redpost A Magic Crystal. And we're going to start it for chapter 1, Fight. And the end of reading at page 5 pages, okay? Because it's a little bit long. And today we're consider reading about it, some Ruby the copycat. And I think the end of reading the stories, okay? And if you like my YouTube, please thumbs up my YouTube. And now order for these 2 book and 2 story and some lots of fun characters. And now here we go. And first you can read Ruby the copycat. Monday was Ruby's first day in Mrs. Hart's class. This is Ruby, announced Mrs. Hart. Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is a girl with a pretty red bow in her hair. And Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, said Mrs. Hart. Does everyone have something to share? I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, said Angela. That's exciting, said Mrs. Hart. And Ruby raised her hand halfway. I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding too. What a coincidence, said Mrs. Hart. And Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. And Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. Class, please take over your reading books, said Mrs. Hart. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on her foot. And when Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. And she slid into her seat behind Angela. I like your bow, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. And class, please take out your math books, said Mrs. Hart. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with dresses on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. And when Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with dashes on it. I like your sweater, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. And on Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-planted t-shirt with matching sneakers. And after lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted and t-shirt with matching sneakers. Oh, I think Ruby liked Angela very much. Why are you sitting like that, whispered Angela. Red pants, said Ruby. And on Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela molded the flower girl dresses she wore at her sister's wedding, and Ruby molded her flower girl dresses too. And right after lunch, Angela didn't whisper anything. And by coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home, and when Angela came back to school, she was wearing black. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. Who would like to read first? Asked Mrs. Hart. Angela raised her hand, and she stood by her desk and read, I had a cat. I could not say because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It sad we never really met." "That was very good," said Mrs. Hart. "Now, who's next?" said Mrs. Hart. Mrs. Hart looked around the room. "Ruby?" And Angela scribbled something on a piece of the paper away. Ruby stood and recited slowly. "I had a nice pet who I never met because it always stayed behind me. And I'm sure it was a cat too." And Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. And someone whispered and Ruby sat down. "What's a consonant?" murmured Mrs. Hart. And Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper, and she passed it to Ruby. "You copied me, and I'm telling Mrs. Hart. P.S. I hate your hair. What, that way?" And Ruby rubbed her chin in the color of the blouse, and a big tear rolling down his nose and popping out of her nose. And when the bell rang, Mrs. Hart sent everyone home except Ruby. And Mrs. Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edges of Ruby's desk. "Ruby, dear," she said gently, "you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be, but Ruby first. I like Ruby." And Mrs. Hart smiled at Ruby. And Ruby smiled at Mrs. Hart's beautiful polished fingernails. "Have a nice weekend." "Have a nice weekend," said Mrs. Hart. "Have a nice weekend," said Ruby. On Monday morning, Mrs. Hart said, "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend." "I did. I went to opera." Mrs. Hart looked around the room. "Does everyone have something to share?" And Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every finger was a pink plastic fingernail. "I went to opera too," said Ruby. "She did not," whispered Angela. And Mrs. Hart floated her hands and looked very serious. "Ruby dear," said Mrs. Hart gently, "did you do anything else this weekend?" And Ruby fingered a fingernail. I hope it," said Ruby. The class giggled, and Ruby's ears turned red. "But I did. I have around the picnic table 10 times." Ruby looked around the room. "Watch." Ruby sprang from her desk, and she hopped forward, and she hopped backward, and she hopped sideways with both eyes shut. And the class cheered and clapped their hands and bits of Ruby's feet, and Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. And Mrs. Hart turned at the tap player and said, "Follow the leader to the Ruby hop." And so Ruby led the class around the room, and while everyone copied her. At noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch. And now the Anna reading this Ruby copycat. Ruby the copycat. And to maybe read some new one book and new one stories, okay? And now Marvin Redpost A Magic Crystal, Chapter 1, Fight. School was over when Marvin Redpost stayed in class. He needed to ask Mrs. Nerf a question. She was going to drop some papers, and Marvin walked to her desk and stared at her until she noticed him, and she turned at him and smiled. "Yes, Marvin." "Excuse me, Mrs. Nerf," said Marvin. "When's the book report due?" "I told you, Tuesday," said Mrs. North, and Marvin nodded, and Mrs. North returned to her papers, and he still didn't know what the report was due. And Mrs. North means there's a due Tuesday, or did she mean that she told him on Tuesday when it was due? And Mrs. North looked at Marvin again, and she seemed surprised he was still there. "Do you have another question?" she said, and she shook his head, and he didn't have another question. And he had the same question. He took his book and walked out of the classroom and then out of the building. And there is a great commotion, Out of the playground, and a large group of kids had glared and used string set, and Marvin would hear a lot of yelling and something shout, "Fire!" and he ran to see what was happening. And when he reached the crowd, he could see two boys fighting on sand and next to things. And one fight was Snore a bride, and Snore was Marvin's best friend. And Marvin pushed away around the crowd and get better look. And another fighter was Nick Toffel. And Nick was also Marvin's best friend. And Marvin had two best friends. They were just rolling around on the ground and cheering and hitting each other. "Get him, Nick," shouted Clarence. "Kill him, Snort," asked Travis. "Rip his ghost out," and screamed Hedda. "Tears up," said Gina, and suddenly everyone stopped shouting as Mr. Copycat had made told the crowd that Mr. Copycat was a principal. "Oh, I think Snort's t-shirt wrapped a little bit, so that means the two of the friends are fight." And Mr. Copycat didn't have to say anything. Nick and Snort stopped fighting. They made it to themselves, and another stood up. "I'm surprised at you, Snort," said Mr. Copycat. "You too, Nick." "Snort started," said Nick. His face was red and angry. "I did not," said Snort. "You did," the pocket. And Snort's turn, and his glasses swung crooked to his face. Oh no, scary. And now the end of reading this Marvin Redpost A Magic crystal. And tomorrow started at 6 pages and the end of reading at chapter 2, okay? And now did it happen? English comics and these book and these stories. But one book and one story because one book and one story will be the same book and same stories, but one book and one story will be borrowed for now, and some new book and new story we see tomorrow, okay? And now, thank you for listening every day and every time. And if you see my YouTube and if you didn't thumbs up at the first time, please thumbs up now, okay? And now, bye for now, and thank you for listening. And bye-bye, everyone. Have a nice day every day and every time. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.